Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh. Welcome to the Future Herd. Today's episode continues our deep dive into food insecurity. Except with this episode, we're going to focus on the rural dynamics. I mean, let's face it, a lot of the talk around food insecurity focuses on cities, focuses on the visible manifestations of whether it's food insecurity, whether it's homelessness, whether it's mental health issues. It's a lot easier to see that stuff in the city than it is in rural communities. And that's why I really enjoyed this conversation with Rob Rayner. Not just because it kind of brought it home to my own community, but because it provides us with a different lens of the food insecurity crisis that's happening presently in Canada. And Rob brings a multidisciplinary perspective. On the one hand, he's leading the local food security organization in Perth, in Lanark County, but he's also the reeve of Tay Valley, which is an adjacent, largely rural community. And this provides him with a lens to see the situation, I think, in a distinct manner compared to some of the louder or more prominent voices in the sector. And if anything, it helps us, as the future herd, get a better grasp on the kind of challenges we face and the types of solutions we should be entertaining. And where I like to bring policy into every conversation that we have here on the Future Herd, this was the first time we got into a specific policy that I suspect is going to be recurring in future episodes. A reminder, of course, that we've got a special website, commons.thefutureherd.ca, where we're trying to map out different perspectives, different opinions, different solutions when it comes to food security. And we'd love for you to take a moment while you're listening to this episode to go over there and press some buttons. Do us a solid. Help us get a sense of what you think the key issues are and where you stand on them, because that'll certainly influence future programming. All right, let's go to the show. Rob, welcome to the Future Herd.
Thank you very much, Jess. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I like starting with a kind of abstract question that's meant to really speak to the intuition or gut response of the guest. So don't be intimidated. Just answer with whatever comes to mind. What does the future mean to you?
That's a big question for sure. What does the future mean to me? Obviously, the future is unknowable, and I think that's the most challenging thing about the future is we just don't know what's in store. We can hypothesize, we can speculate, we can dream, but it's completely unknown. And as you know, from being a human being, from 1 hour to the next, 1 minute to the next, things happen that are you didn't expect. So, I'm hopeful for the future, but also very deeply concerned about the trajectory we're on. Yeah.
Right on, right on. A very balanced and appropriate response. And I will confess, I've been really looking forward to our conversation for a bunch of different reasons, which we'll get to unpack today. But one of the biggest is we've been looking at food security here on the Future Herd and really trying to wrap our heads around different elements that comprise food security here in Canada. And a couple of episodes ago, I was able to speak with Neil Hetherington from the Toronto Daily Food Bank, and it kind of gave the big city perspective on food insecurity and kind of the community services there. And I was, as a consequence, really excited to talk to you, partly because of your role in kind of smaller town food banks, but you also similarly have a role in rural municipal governance and services. So that's kind of a context set setup, but of course, like any future Herd episode, we do not know the tangents we will take and the digressions that we will indulge in. But why don't we start with, the usual origin story, which I will frame almost equally as vague as my first question, which is, where did you get your sense of social responsibility from? And I say this because even though you and I could take for granted, as you evoked in your intro, that every human should have it, not everyone does. And I think it gives a sense of character.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a great question. And I've actually thought about it a lot over my life. I would pin my social awareness, social conscience, largely to my maternal grandparents. I grew up on the West Coast in North Vancouver, and my maternal grandparents lived just outside of Ladysmith on Vancouver Island. And they were blue collar, they were working class, they were big supporters of the New Democrat Party. They campaigned for a fellow named Jim Manley, who was elected member of parliament several times from that part of the country. And, they would just get themselves very worked up and riled up when I would go and visit them in the summertime about the issues of the day. Much more so than my own parents would, although my parents were socially conscious as well. But in particular, my maternal grandparents would have conversations about the issues of the day and, would express frustration as to why aren't things being done a certain way and so forth. So I think I just kind of absorbed that without myself being in any way active as a teenager on any kind of issue. That didn't come until really my early 20s. But that's kind of where I trace it. And thankfully, both my parents, too, were, they read the news, they kept up with what's going on in the world, they would talk about issues at the table. But yeah, I think that's where it began for me. I had that exposure to other people who talked about things that were beyond themselves. Yeah.
Right on. And, as an aside, that's one of the key things, one of our recurring threads on the podcast is looking at youth leadership and how do we empower young people. And you kind of reminded me that part of it is just inviting them to be part of the conversation, inviting them, to be there when we get excited about policy, when we get excited about issues, because you described a certain kind of an infection that certainly applied in my own family case as well. So I can identify that. Now, I kind of want to, because there's so much I want to talk about today, I think we are going to be kind of nonlinear and jumping around. But I came across you, I learned about you because of your association with The Table, which is kind of the community food center in Perth, Ontario, which is in Eastern Ontario, where I happen to live, and that's why I looked it up. So give us a sense of The Table, kind of what it does, and perhaps what makes it unique, at least in the region, if not larger, because it does seem to have a character that distinguishes it from some of the other organizations active in the sector.
Yeah, for sure. So the Table Community Food Center was was founded as the Perth and District Food Bank in 1998. And it worked as a food bank for, 15 or so years. Then around 2012, and I've only been involved for less than a year with the organization, but around 2011, 2012, people involved at that time learned about this concept of a community food center, which was pioneered out of Toronto. And the food bank transitioned to become a community food center in 2012. And the idea is, so we still run it, we still have a food bank. It's our biggest program, but we have other programs as well where food is at the core, food that brings people together. Like, for example, our community meals program, which is Monday, Wednesday, Friday dinners, free to anybody in the community, can just come and share a meal. We have a community garden program. We have a children and youth program. We have what we call an advocacy program, where our staff will provide assistance to people if they need help accessing some government programs and so forth. Often those people are coming into the food bank, and then they learn that, the table can do these other things for me as well, and so we try to give them some help. We have a satellite program in Smiths Falls called the Falls Food Hub program, which is we're just closing in on finalizing renovations to a space there. And once that space is ready, which should be in late May or early June, we will start offering a broader array of programs in Smiths Falls that are consistent with the community food center concept. There's 18 community food centers in Canada. We were the second to be established. Most of them are in urban settings, big city settings, but there's several that are in rural communities like ours. And then there's 4 of the 18 are indigenous led and situated within indigenous communities in different parts of the country. And all of it is networked by a group called Right to Food, which is the group that started this whole concept of a community food center. And a big part of it is to work towards empowering people, building community, building resilience with food at the core. But it's not strictly just a food bank where we're just temporarily alleviating food insecurity. We're trying to help people in a more sustained way so that they can hopefully eventually not be food insecure and have perhaps not only skills and knowledge that they didn't have before to do with food or other things, but they've actually built more of a sense of community.
Right on. And I think I want to unpack a little bit about that network, but at the same time, you kind of provide me with an opportunity. You pointed out that your relationship with the table is relatively short, even though I imagine you've been aware of their activities, in the area for some time. Oh, yes. It strikes me that affords you a unique perspective. I love talking to leaders about their perspective, kind of about what they see as an affordance of their position. But fresh eyes is in of itself often a very valuable perspective. So I'm kind of curious, were there things that you didn't expect that surprised you? And, were there elements in terms of coming in as an interim executive director that maybe surprised the organization, right? And I say this because it strikes me that's when there's an opportunity to see things differently.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm actually a big believer in healthy organizational turnover, particularly at the top. Like every number of years, bring in someone new because, yeah, they can lend those fresh set of eyes and maybe bring in some practices that hadn't been done before. So I think there's great value in that. I'm not sure if although I didn't know very much about the inner workings of the table prior to coming on in June. I've been around the not-for-profit and charitable sector for some time, so kind of the nature of not-for-profit and charitable work was not at all unfamiliar to me. Certainly the work itself has been very challenging just given the external demands, maybe even the external expectations on an organization like this, because we're trying to do so much. We have 7 or 8 programs, we have 15, 16 staff, but we're situated within a relatively small rural community of a sort of a regional population of 20,000. And within that context, there's perhaps only so much sort of money that we can raise to support all that we're trying to do. So it's the magnitude of the challenge of the work has been not a surprise, but it's been a reality for sure. All of our staff do the best they can with the resources they have. We're currently working out of the same building where we've been for 14 years now, but the building itself has physical constraints for example, it'd be nice to have more space for a larger food bank, more space for more programming that we can do with children and youth, a bigger dining hall that we can serve more community meals and so forth. So that's very much on the radar of the board. They're very much aware that our current building has these sort of operational constraints. But what's been, I guess, maybe a bit of a surprise is just the amount of community support there is for the table. It comes from so many different directions, from small businesses that are making contributions, people who are doing food drives, people who've become monthly donors. It's heartening. We kind of see that virtually every day. This expression of support and solidarity for the table's mission, and that's great. And hopefully other not-for-profits in our region are also seeing the same thing. I'm sure they are. Big Brothers Big Sisters, YAC, the Youth Action Committee group in Perth, I'm sure they see very similar things. And maybe in a smaller rural community, perhaps that kind of thing is a bit more visible because people know each other. There's so many connections. So many of us on staff or as volunteers also know each other from other involvements that we're engaged in. So, it's nice. I've lived about half my life in small and rural communities and the other half in urban areas, and I much prefer the small rural community because of the opportunity to meet so many people, get to know them, and hopefully collaborate.
Well, and let's explore that kind of dynamic a little in the context of both that challenge and opportunity frame, because part of the reason as a podcast we decided to focus in particular on food security and conversely food insecurity is we are anticipating these things kind of getting worse before they get better, because of the nature of what's happening in the world. And to your point, in an urban environment, while on the one hand it might seem like the access to fundraising, the access to supports might be more ready, there is the disconnect that is perhaps contrasted in the smaller community where you can feel those pain points, but you can also see the community and touch the community and kind of rally the community. So give me a sense of how, as an organization, on the one point, like I think you articulated your point of being able to expand the food bank as a very tangible kind of challenge that you wrap your head around. How do you think about moving forward, whether in the short term or the long term, of making not so much do with less, but rising to the challenges that the community faces with the kind of, unique constraints, but also unique resources that are available in a community like Perth?
Yeah, very good question. In a very tangible sense, our annual budget is around 1.1 million. It's grown. That's almost double from what it was about 10 or 11 years ago. In my view, we need to see it get up to 1.5 to 1.6 million. So it's a question of how we can do that. Where can we find those resources, including not being so dependent on grants from foundations or whatever, because that's so hit or miss. And just even the past 10 days or so, we've received rejections on several grant applications. So how can we build a more sustainable, ideally largely regional base of support that's going to be with us and allow us to offer that much more in services? I would love to see us undertake a capital campaign to renovate and perhaps expand our building, because there is potential for space expansion, and undertake renovations so we have a more functional building for our staff, for our volunteers, for the people who are coming and using our programs and services. So we are in the midst of a strategic planning process, and at this point in time, it looks like the board isn't going to be quite ready to commit to a capital campaign per se. Maybe that'll come in about a year's time or so, because we have some other sort of foundational things that we're still working on. But a lot of this does come down to having enough money to be able to do what needs to be done. So I'm hoping over the next 1, 2, or 3 years we can move towards being ready to undertake a capital campaign and then see that through, and then we'd have a better space to serve the regional community. We have people coming from from Smiths Falls, from Lanark Highlands, Drummond North Elmsley, probably some people more in the eastern end of Lanark County as well, who are coming to the table for programs and services, and we want to be able to serve as many people as possible. And I do think, given what's going on in the world today, given the trajectories that impact food security, unfortunately, I see things getting more difficult, not less. So we have to try to be ready for that.
Well, and to validate what you're saying, certainly there is an obvious need for a capital campaign, for the kind of resources that would allow you to expand your facilities and serve the community. But of course, the other kind of element of infrastructure in the social sector, in a social enterprise, is volunteer labor and the non-monetary dynamic. I'm curious how you guys approach that. And I don't exclusively just mean voluntary. I mean non-monetary in the sense that there is a wide range of non-monetary contributions and elements that go into facilitating community services. So I'd love to hear how you guys think about that and how you approach it.
Yeah, well, we simply couldn't exist without our volunteer base. We have a sizable number of people who volunteer in the food bank or in our community meals program, in our garden, at the Falls Food Hub in Smiths Falls. I don't have a precise figure, but we're somewhere in the range of 150 volunteers at any given time. And we have lots of people who express interest in volunteering, and then we try to find a good fit for their time, their skills, their interest, and what we actually need. So, yeah, again, without that base of volunteers, we simply couldn't be doing anywhere close to what we're doing. And what's kind of neat for me has been observing how the volunteers themselves benefit from that involvement. I think without question, for some of them, it's an intensely positive social time in their week. They look forward to coming into the table. They see others who are volunteering and the staff, and there's this camaraderie. It can work really, really well. And so, yeah, volunteers are giving, but they're also receiving a lot. And I've heard those kind of comments directly from some volunteers. It's for some of them, I think it's actually the table is actually a kind of a linchpin in their lives at present. It gives them so much meaning. We have a volunteer a coordinator. Well, it's one of the hats she wears. She wears several hats, but her main hat is volunteer coordination. So her name is Haley, and she receives the expressions of interest from people to volunteer, and then we go through a process by which we determine what might be the best fit for that individual. And then once they're aboard, try to make sure they have sufficient orientation and training to undertake whatever it is they may end up doing.
Now, when I spoke with Neil from the Toronto Food Bank, around the same subject, he really emphasized culture, and I think that's partly a consequence of having a much larger core of volunteers because their infrastructure and their operations are larger. But I think it's also due to the kind of urban anonymity that a city like Toronto fosters compared to the more local familiarity, not to mention that the table kind of has as part of its programs a cultural dynamic. But nonetheless, I'm curious in the way that Toronto really elevates culture as an explicit element of the volunteer strategy. Is it implicit in the smaller community? Like, is it something that people are just naturally part of? Or is it also something that, again, you kind of emphasize as part of that larger notion of belonging and cohesion?
Yeah, I would say through the community food center model, the intent is to establish and maintain kind of a culture of solidarity with our fellow citizens. So we don't call people coming to the food bank, for example, or using other programs, we don't call them clients or whatever. We call them participants because they're choosing to come. And we're able to serve, but it's in an atmosphere of solidarity because we all recognize that we could be the ones also coming to a food bank and making use of those services because we're also vulnerable. And everyone has a story as to how it is that they came to an organization like the table for help. Or for that sense of community, which one of the great things about our community meals program, because those meals are open to anybody, we do see people coming in who just like the ambiance of the dining hall, that free meal, very nutritious, very tasty meals prepared by our chef and their assistants and the volunteers, and they just sit down with their fellow citizens and have a nice time. So that I think that the culture we're really trying to foster is one of total respect, non-judgmental, solidarity, and also fun. Trying to make sure that everyone's having kind of a good time in the process. There is quite a bit of laughter going on during a community meal, and the preparation for the community meal. The atmosphere in the dining hall is really, really, really nice. These are kind of the intangible aspects of being involved or witnessing on the inside what it's like to see how a community food center operates as perhaps opposed to some other types of frontline organizations.
Well, and let's use that as an opportunity to kind of situate those programs or those services within your larger perspective that you have, as a public servant, as a politician, in that you've been the reeve of Tay Valley. And for city people listening, reeve is kind of the rural equivalent of a mayor. I'm curious how that gives you a kind of bigger picture of the needs of the community, because we've been talking about kind of the food security needs, but the flip side to this is many of your constituents are farmers, are involved in agriculture, in part because that's the nature of being in a rural municipality. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those connections and how they fit into the larger picture that you've been afforded.
Yeah, again, very good question. Yeah, so Tay Valley Township, just west of Perth, is of course a rural municipality, about 550 square kilometers, year-round population of about 6,000 people, has a rich history of agriculture going back a couple hundred years, many active working farms, largely smaller scale. We have a number of organic farmers. And some of those farmers or farms, directly support the table, sometimes through donations of produce and so forth. And then there's other farms around the table, like in Drummond North Elmsley and further afield, that also support the table with either donations or lower prices on produce, for example. As a municipal politician, I've certainly seen with the gradation of the population. Tay Valley is actually made up of significant portion of our population is older. We're above the provincial average in terms of the number or percentage of people who are 55 years and older. And many of those folks do come from long-standing families, farming families, and so forth. So we actually don't have a sizable younger demographic in Tay Valley, and that's quite common in a lot of rural communities now as well. We certainly have people living in low income. One of the neat crossovers for me as reeve has been our Maberley Community Hall, which is one of our two municipally owned community halls. It's our main one in the hamlet of Maberley. And for the past couple of years, the township has received some grant money to put on a free community meal once a month. It's on the third Thursday of the month. It's a lunch. Different caterers cater a given event. We've just now escalated that to 2 free meals a month. So it's very compatible with our community meals program at the table, which is Monday, Wednesday, Friday dinners, and our Falls Food Hub program in Smiths Falls. It's a Monday lunch, and soon we think also a Tuesday dinner. So now we have twice a month Thursday lunches at the Maberley Hall, and sometimes the table is the caterer supporting that, particularly the holiday meal in November. And I've seen also at those community meals that people come from all different backgrounds and walks of life, and I've heard directly from some people that for them, it's kind of like the highlight of their day or their week because they don't get out very much. They don't have a lot of money. They don't travel around. They're a little bit isolated, which can be an issue in any community, but it can be a big issue in rural communities, or rural isolation, particularly of seniors. So we see a lot of those folks coming to the community meal at the Maberley Hall, and there is this direct tie between that program and the table. So it's been nice to sort of bear witness to all of that.
And if anything, it kind of speaks to a larger social purpose that's being served in terms of your point about social isolation, but also the aging demographics that I think are a challenge for a lot of rural municipalities. It's interesting to learn that Tay Valley is kind of, even more so in terms of facing that demographic pressure. So I'd love for you to kind of elaborate on the role that these types of meals play play, but on a larger picture, the role that this kind of programming could and should play. And this is where we get to transition to the not so much the utopian part of the episode, but the hopeful part of the episode, where we get to entertain having more resources than we currently have. What could that entail? Like, if we were to be serious about, both social isolation as a growing concern, I think, for all ages, but in particular, how it compounds an aging community, how it makes it even more difficult to not just deal with the mental health issues, but mobilize the volunteer base, foster the sense of solidarity. So let's dig deeper here, both in terms of the role that's being played, but the role that could be played, if we had access to greater resources.
Yeah, I mean, I was in St. John Catholic High School yesterday morning. I gave talks to two different classes on the subject of basic income, and which was interesting in and of itself. But kind of overlapping that was this issue of young students, high school students, not showing up for class, and I made reference to one of the teachers I was talking to a great article in the Toronto Star last week by a young, I think she's grade 11 student somewhere in Ontario. She wrote a piece about why is it that students aren't showing up for class, and she made reference to the pandemic, and that during the pandemic, education had to be at home, and so students got kind of used to that, and now a lot of instruction remains online, which they can do from home. And I learned yesterday that apparently the province has been encouraging students to take a certain percentage of their education at home online. Well, of course, the more we spend on our screens at home, isolated from other people, the more we're actually not connected to other people. And the in-person value of connecting with people in person can't be stressed enough. Just like we are intensely social creatures, we depend on interaction with each other in person to build connections. I attended a square dance at the Maverly Hall last Saturday night. It was a lot of fun. First one I've been to in like 40 plus years. It was packed. It was a fundraiser for the table, and oh my God, just so much fun. It was young, there were little kids, there were older people, everything in between, everyone having a great time. Well, that is so rare now to find those kinds of opportunities. So if I'm ahead of a government like Ontario or the federal government, they should be looking at what they can do to promote social connection in person. We've heard of the crisis of loneliness in our society and all the rest of it. Well, a lot of that has to do with the rise of the digital era and people being able to plug into their devices and not interacting with their fellow human beings. You go to an airport, for example, and virtually everybody's on the phone, and I've been guilty of it too. I can remember a time when you went to the airport, there were no devices. You sat down, maybe you talked to the stranger next to you. And, yeah, we need much more social connection, and the table helps in that regard. But yeah, governments should be seriously looking at social isolation and what they can do to help counter that.
Although you did just now evoke another contributing factor, which is economics. That certainly, if I think back to my youth in terms of the places I could go without spending money or without having to pay to enter, compared to where we are now, where there aren't many what people call third spaces, or there aren't many places where you can go and not have to spend money and just be. And then your point about the table rather being involved in a square dance fundraiser. Is there an opportunity for an organization like the Table, which is already creating third spaces in terms of your facilities, but playing a role in facilitating these types of events or these types of environments? In no small part because food is a social catalyst, right? It is a social enabler. But also because no one else is doing it. And it's kind of an opportunity here for leadership in kind of a moment of social crisis, although I could be getting too ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to do as much as we can as an organization at the Table to promote social connection. The Tay Valley Township, beyond the meals activity. The Maberly Hall, we secured some grants to kind of provide some upgrading of the hall, like for example, making it accessible, physically accessible, which it wasn't before, and then some other upgrades just to the structure itself. And we've seen a huge increase in the amount of use of the hall. For many years, it wasn't being used very much at all, but now with some grant money supporting all kinds of activity going on there now, Tai Chi classes, yoga classes, um, just concerts and events and so forth. Um, I'm a member of the Tay Valley Community Choir. We do our rehearsals there. We do our spring and fall performances there. The infrastructure we have. Community halls, I think, are a really, really important part of public infrastructure or community infrastructure. So government should be looking to ensure that those halls are properly resourced, and the volunteers are out there to organize activity. So government just needs to provide a bit of baseline assurance that there's going to be some funding to allow that to happen. But this whole digital stuff is really weighing on me because it seems we're getting sucked further and further into it. And now with AI potentially sucking us further into, if you will, almost dependence on the technology to be able to function, it's a huge concern because I think with every step we take further into the digital world, we become that much more separated from, if you will, the human experience.
Well, and as an aside, I think that dependence has kind of already been established on a connectivity level, which those of us in rural communities, we felt that pain point for quite some time in terms of not having access to the same type of high-speed connectivity that cities have. But it kind of, before we get deeper into the policy conversation, which I'm absolutely excited to do, you just inspired in me another interesting urban-rural contrast, which I'd love to throw at you, where one of the perhaps advantages of an urban environment is poverty is visible, right? It's easier to see people who are experiencing, homelessness. It's easier to see people who are experiencing addiction. So it's a little easier for civic leaders and people involved in social enterprises to quantify the problem and try to address it. But it strikes me in a rural community that may not exist. There may not be the same level of visibility in the sense that one of the consequences of social isolation could be invisibility. Could be that people withdraw into their rural property, withdraw into loneliness or addiction or poverty, and you might not know. How do you, both as a community leader, but also vis-a-vis, the responsibilities of the table and trying to help the community, how do you compensate for that? How do you try to surface where some of the need has to go or help identify the problems that could be harder to identify as a result of the different context?
Yeah, you're asking great questions here, and it is kind of a complex one. I think it is true, definitely, that in rural communities, poverty, as we might imagine it to be, may not be quite as visible. Um, there are also people who, in rural areas, actually live quite well on comparatively low income because they've got certain skills or knowledge that allows them maybe to grow a lot of their own food or do a lot of their own maintenance, and so they actually don't need a higher income. Whereas in urban areas, that may not be quite as true. I mean, maybe a little more income dependent. Um, I think for people to understand the linkages between low income and poor health outcomes, for example, is important. In other words, there is a baseline of income that everyone really should have to make sure that they can live a decent life. Doesn't mean that they're going off to Disneyland, once a year or whatever, but at least that they can afford, if they're purchasing food, they can afford food of sufficient quality and quantity. They have a solid roof over themselves. They have shelter that's comfortable. They can afford basic clothing and other basic needs. So, to the extent that people some people don't have that reality and are suffering the consequence of stress or hunger or any number of other manifestations of poverty. There is a direct correlation between those situations and people's health outcomes immediately and later in life. So, I think it's very important that our senior governments, by which I mean our provincial and federal governments primarily, recognize the strong, powerful correlation between low income, say involuntary low income, and negative outcomes, both health and other outcomes, for individuals and for the greater society. Which is why I'm such a big supporter of the concept of basic income, and have been for quite some time. I believe that fundamentally everyone should have access to a minimum income floor, whether you live in the rural area or the urban area. And in a big rich country like Canada, I know we can afford that. It comes down to sort of political will and also public support. We do live in a dominant culture, I think, where people have the idea that the way you stabilize your life is through work and employment. But that's such a flawed concept, given what we know of all the ways in which stable employment or the pursuit of stable employment can be challenged or interrupted due to circumstances that people may be facing. So,
and
yeah.
I'll even go further and indulge in the privilege of being a podcast host, where part of the mandate of being a podcast host is introducing personal anecdote. I only had one job my entire life. It was when I was 17, washing hair in a salon before people got their hair cut. It lasted about 11 months before I quit. And I've never been able to get a job since, for a bunch of reasons that tie to disability and health and intellect. So for us to have a society that says work is a central component of one's status or dignity, then we have to acknowledge that the vast majority of people are not allowed to do the work that they want to do. And that's a problem. And what strikes me as appealing about universal basic income is not the concept that it discourages people from work, quite the opposite, that it actually allows them to focus on the work that they should be doing and that they would therefore be a valuable member of society, because they don't need to get into the precarity that is contemporary employment. A bit of a digression on my part, but I say this to say you introduced to me a framing of this particular policy issue that I haven't heard other proponents do so specifically or explicitly, which is the idea that farmers in particular should have a kind of universal basic income. And while on the one hand, I agree, everybody should have a universal basic income. I think for city people, there's a different context in which they imagine it. Yet people who are not familiar with agriculture are not able to realize that it is a very subsidized sector. I mean, already almost everyone in agriculture is benefiting from some subsidy somewhere. It strikes me that it would be easy if, to your point, we just created that bottom, that floor that said, if you're going to be in the job of helping people make their food, we want to give you a base income so you can focus on the food and not have a day job, not have 3 day job, as all farmers in Eastern Ontario have, if they're lucky. So I would love for you, and you can go wherever you want with the universal basic income idea, but I would love for you to situate it in the role that it could play with agriculture. Because again, I haven't heard a lot of the proponents of the idea do so. And I think it's a very powerful framing that speaks to that we're not negating work, we're enabling work.
Yep. No, absolutely. I fully agree that were a decent level of basic income available to adults, working age adults, the vast majority would use that to make choices that are better for themselves, including the work that they most would like to pursue. I'll come back to agriculture in a moment, but I just wanted to sort of flag that in Ireland, the government of Ireland has just this month made permanent a basic income program to support artists. They did a 3-year pilot project involving 2,000 professional artists who would benefit from a little more income security. And the pilot was so successful, the government is now going to make it a permanent program, again, to benefit up to 2,000 artists around the country who are professional, but for whatever reason, their income is not quite there that they can totally make a go of it. And Ireland has done that, recognizing the benefit of the arts to the larger society, and that's well established. Uh, the value that musicians and painters and sculptors, the immense value they add to our enjoyment of life, so to speak. So that's really interesting to me. But on agriculture, my understanding is the National Farmers Union in Canada has come out in favor of a basic income. And I think there's very, very strong argument for introducing a basic income, perhaps specifically to support those engaging in farming, and perhaps even more specifically, those who are a bit younger who may find it difficult to enter into farming if they don't have any background in it but have an intense interest in it. I know there's issues around access to land and resources and all the rest of it. But even just having a bit of a stable baseline, so if you want to begin to become a producer, you've got at least that floor of income that is going to be there for you if you need it. So I think there's a lot there. Going a little bit further, when I think about food insecurity today and where it may be going in the future, man, we're gonna need a huge cohort of people who not only know how to produce food, but know how to produce food in a steadily warming climate, are keeping up with the science of crop, crop production in a warming climate, and what's really going to work when the temperature is a little higher than it is today. There's obviously a lot coming at us in the near future that I think farmers are going to have to contend with and probably are contending with right now. So again, stability of a baseline income makes a whole lot of sense to me. I do think that this idea of a universal basic income could be extended across the general population, but of all the many sectors to think about, what could be more important than the sector involved in hopefully assuring that we have a food supply that we can depend upon in the future?
Absolutely. And you inspired an even more challenging question that I'm going to throw at you. And in acknowledging that it is challenging, I give you leeway to dodge or elaborate as you see fit. But could the concept of a basic income also combine with the demographic challenge that we talked about earlier? And I say this because you brought out the reality that young people who want to get into farming, if they're not born into it, it's a very daunting task. And it's not just the cost of land, it's even access to knowledge and expertise.
Sure.
I would love to hear you riff. And again, you can bail if you feel it's too challenging. I would love to hear you riff as a reeve, even though you're not running for re-election. Maybe that gives you more freedom. What would be strategies to get young people to move to Tay Valley, right? And again, thinking about if basic income was part of it, right? So they didn't have to necessarily worry about finding direct and local employment. But have you thought about ways to address the aging challenge that a lot of rural communities face? And what are some of the means, especially now as we blue sky around thoughts of basic income, that we could get younger people saying, hey, I would like to have a more rural or a more small town lifestyle?
Yeah, I mean that's a huge question. It's a huge challenge. There's so many components to it, and we've had discussions at the municipal level. The lack of certain infrastructure. I'll point to, for example, rural transportation. There's virtually no public transportation that people can make use of for getting around. You pretty much are car dependent. And if you're not car dependent, you're probably living in the town of Perth or the town of Smith Falls, and you're walking kind of everywhere. I know Carl Place has a bus service. I think Smith Falls does as well, but Perth does not. So just Lanark County, because I sit on Lanark County Council, is looking at rural transportation and some options for introducing more capacity there. But that's the kind of thing. If you're a young if you're a young and single adult in Ottawa or Toronto, or perhaps a couple, maybe you've got a young family that you'd like to move out of the city and move into a rural area like ours, man, there's a lot to consider. We've got one elementary school, relatively small population. It's been decreasing over the years. The high schools are two high schools in Perth. Tay Valley, in fact, we don't even have a grocery store in Tay Valley. It's kind of, there's no physical center to Tay Valley. There's no gas station in Tay Valley. There's virtually almost nothing in terms of infrastructure. So, the first thing I would say that probably if young people are moving into a place like Tay Valley, they're going to have a vehicle for getting themselves around. But then there, of course, just the spiraling costs of housing, the spiraling costs of land, that sort of macroeconomic pressure on all kinds of households today. It is super daunting. And a lot of it points to what has happened over a number of decades, where we've seen ever rising inequality between those who are increasingly pulling away from virtually everybody else. And we hear about the 1%, but it's also kind of the top 10 to 20% of the population in Canada continues to pull away economically, financially away from everybody else. And governments have to take a serious look at addressing steep income and wealth inequality so that we can hopefully have something of a rebalancing of resources. Because money represents energy. The more money you have, the more energy you are going to be able to make use of. If you are in low income, you kind of are living a low energy life. And to the extent we can maybe have more equity between higher income individuals, higher income households, and lower income, if we had stronger equity, I think you'd see more robust communities, both rural and urban. And I can point to the Nordic countries are kind of famous for this. There's greater equality within the Nordic countries, and year after year, they not only rank as among the most socially and economically vibrant societies on the planet, but Finland, as you may know, for 7 or 8 years has also been voted or has ranked as the happiest country in the world. And I think a lot of it has to do with they simply have greater social cohesion as a result of their governments being willing to have greater equality on the income and the wealth spectrum.
So I've been trying to do what I do here on the podcast, which is ratchet up the difficulty or complexity of the question as I go along, kind of as a test to the guest of their leadership chops. And you've been doing absolutely a stellar so far. But, now that we're running out of time, on your last point, let me throw a curveball at you, which again, you're welcome to dodge. But you have run both successfully and unsuccessfully for political office here in the region. I don't know if you intend to run, say, provincially or federally again in the future, but I loved what you just said. I thought you really kind of described the problem, but also described an excellent way for us to approach it. So my $1 million question is this: how do you communicate that to a diverse constituency? How do you communicate that to a constituency that often's not that interested in politics, except maybe when it comes to cast a ballot? How do we shift people's perceptions of what is possible? Given that I kind of find in urban environments, political debates are more volatile, so it's easier to kind of get people interested in the issues just out of a drama perspective, versus I kind of find in rural ridings there's a little bit of the if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and it's hard to get people to realize it's broke. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it takes to communicate what you just brilliantly articulated, but needs to be translated a little to reach a diverse constituency.
Again, very good question. Certainly I found in my political involvement, you encounter a full range of people, some who are intensely interested in these kinds of topics and are deep thinkers and have put incredible thought towards a lot of the kinds of things we're talking about, and it's wonderful to engage with those folks. and then others who, maybe have public interests, but they're relatively narrow public interests, and for whatever reason aren't maybe going to go there intellectually around some of these kinds of topics. The reality is within any government, be it municipal, provincial, and federal, there's going to be kind of a mix of people who have those sort of aptitudes, which can be frustrating because so much of what I think needs to be done at the systemic level. It needs to be done through very thoughtful policy that also takes the long view, recognizing that the changes that we need to make aren't going to happen in a day, a week, a month, or a year. They're going to take 10, 20, 40, 50 years to fully kind of unfold. So it is really challenging. I found as a municipal politician, I get frustrated with sort of, issues that are pretty minute, pretty almost petty, yet they require my time or someone's time, and we have to focus on those things, while at the same time, bigger issues that are also affecting the population, we're not spending any time on those at all. And this is just a function of modern life. It's hard to get really ahead of the curve on some of these issues, and that's why we hear this phrase of sort of what's the phrase? I want to say intractable problem, but like the climate crisis is so upon us now and will be even more so in the future. But it's somewhat of an intractable problem to solve because it's so multifaceted, it's so long term and short term. There's so many moving parts to it, and it's hard to wrap your head around it as a citizen, let alone as a politician. Same goes with AI now. I think AI has all this apparent promise, but also a huge amount of apparent peril, and it's hard to wrap your head around how do we get ahead of the curve on an issue like that. I think at the end of the day, as a politician, as a citizen, I've come to accept that maybe the best that can be done are relatively small, relatively incremental improvements. But if we concede certain ideas in the minds of other people, particularly younger people, who might be the leaders of tomorrow, that's also something of a legacy we can leave. And I am confident that some of the people who are much younger than I am will emerge in time and become some of those thought leaders and hopefully action leaders in the future.
Right on. Fantastic answer. That leaves us to the last two questions that I end the interview on. The second last is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you think we should touch upon before we conclude?
I know the title of the podcast is The Future Herd, and you're a farmer and you're heavily engaged in agriculture and so forth. Just back to the climate crisis, something that I've found very troubling reading about recently has been this apparent weakening or potential weakening of the North Atlantic oceanic circulation system, which has happened before in the geologic past. If it happens again, it would result in a tremendous, basically like a little mini ice age in the northern parts of the northern hemisphere, including parts of Europe. And that's the kind of thing that I read about that. It's kind of scary. Who's talking about it? You open up the news and they're talking about the latest fashion of whatever, which is fine too. We all need to be able to take our minds to those kinds of things. But in terms of food security, I'm really I'm very interested in what the researchers or what research is showing with regard to climate impacts on agriculture today and the future, and how can we possibly best adapt to what experts are projecting will be the climate in the near future, the next number of decades, or early in the next century.
Right on, Rob. A great answer. And certainly in my own case, I became a farmer because I wanted to be on the front lines of climate change. I did not want to be stuck in a city feeling like there was nothing I can do. So I think you hit it right on the nose. And finally, the last question, kind of like the first question, this is meant to be a gut response. You're not supposed to think about this for any time. This isn't an Academy Award acceptance speech. But who are the leaders that you look up to, whether dead or alive, whether famous or unknown, but who are the people that the rest of us should be paying attention to or looking for some form of inspiration or leadership?
Yeah, I have long admired Mahatma Gandhi. I read a fantastic biography of him many decades ago, and that's really stuck with me. He was just an incredible person. And one of the great lines he had is that there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And that's really stuck with me because I think greed is a huge, huge problem in our species. This capacity for people just to want to have ever more. Elon Musk close to becoming the world's first trillionaire. I mean, how ridiculous is that? So Mahatma Gandhi for sure. Because of the situation south of the border, I follow the U.S. politics quite closely and have for years. So I'm kind of looking for those current leaders in the U.S. who might emerge as the not as the savior, but try to help turn that country around once Mr. Trump is no longer in office, which can't come soon enough. There's some state level leaders that have kind of impressed me about how they kind of conduct themselves, like Andy Beshears, who's the governor of Kentucky. He's a Democrat, but he governs a red state. He seems very impressive to me. Yeah, I mean, those are a couple of names, but lots of other people. Franklin Roosevelt was in my view, a great president. Was very focused on helping. Of course, Abraham Lincoln.
Well,
In
and
Canada, yeah, I mean, I have my focus as well, but those are a couple of names that come to mind.
I was going to say you're on a roll, but you are starting to transition into the Academy Award acceptance speech. So that's where we have to play the music to send you off.
All right.
This has been a fantastic conversation, Rob. I really appreciate your perspective. And I appreciate you both bringing up the climate change because unfortunately we haven't had enough guests reminding us of the incredible challenge that faces this sector, but also that you brought up the universal basic income, because I don't think you're going to be the last guest to tie that in to the role that it can play in agriculture, let alone the role that it can play in terms of food security. So thank you very much. This is really, I think, for me, but also for our guests, has been a good understanding of the rural dynamics that play into the larger food security fabric. To add insult to injury, Rob was perhaps the first guest that has worse internet than I do. And I have to express considerable gratitude to Rob, not only providing what was an incredible and insightful conversation, but he had to then leave his laptop open for essentially the rest of the day in order for the file to upload so that we could get the quality of the conversation and audio that we did. This is something a lot of city dwellers really just don't understand, which is how horrific rural internet in Canada remains. Granted, there were some upgrades as a consequence of funding that came during the lockdowns and the pandemic, where we had this brief moment where rural connectivity and high-speed internet was valued. But as a society, we've forgotten about that, and the cities led by Silicon Valley continue to race forward into the future, and rural residents struggle to, in this case, even have a podcast conversation while doing the rest of their work throughout the course of the day. So thank you, Rob, for the conversation and for your patience in allowing us to share that conversation with listeners all around the world. We're going to move forward from the food insecurity topic to start looking at food sociology, food studies, the culture of food. It's not to suggest that we're wrapping up when it comes to food insecurity and food security, but we're moving on a cyclical nature when it comes to the subjects that we research and the knowledge that we mobilize here on the Future Herd. And I really felt that today's conversation with Rob leaves us with a lot of action. Action to move forward, whether it's in policy, whether it's conceiving our food system. And so it's not that we are closing a chapter on food insecurity, but more, we're going to explore other loops before we come back to it. Nonetheless, I am asking you once again to go to our website, click on the link to the Commons, and share your views on the topic. We will be adding more topics on the Commons in the days and weeks to come. But I really feel that there have been a number of insights, a number of opportunities that we've been able to surface by looking at the larger food security issue. And I want to make sure that we integrate them as we move forward and continue the conversations with leaders from our agri-food sector. If you have any feedback, please send it to us. If you want to give us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice, by all means. And if you want to tell us how terrible we are, this is where I will remind you that X, once known as Twitter, is a wonderful place to air your grievances in the hopes that other disgruntled people will carry them forward. Until then, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and we'll see you soon.